The crystal tablet felt cold in Taemin's hands as he read the message for the third time that morning, the alien symbols glowing with soft blue light that hurt his eyes after looking at them too long, and outside the viewport of the orbital station. The 7 massive ships hung in space like sleeping giants waiting to wake up. Each alien vessel stretched longer than the human cities below and bristled with weapons that could turn planets into dust, their hulls made from materials that human science could barely understand, let alone replicate. And Taemin knew that the smallest of those ships carried enough firepower to destroy every human settlement in this system without breaking a sweat. The message was simple in its words but terrible in its meaning, calling Ambassador Taemin and all human representatives to appear before the Galactic Council within 10 standard days to answer for what they called aggressive expansion across 17 star systems. And the tone made it clear this was not a request, but a command that brooked no refusal. Hanna pressed her face against the observation deck window and watched the alien ships with the fascination of an engineer who had spent her whole life building things that these visitors could destroy with a thought. And she counted 7 different types of vessels representing 7 different species that had come together for one purpose. The crystalline ships of the Vex caught the light from New Sol's sun and scattered it into rainbow patterns that danced. Across the station's hull, their surfaces looking like someone had carved them from enormous diamonds and then taught them to fly through space with grace that defied physics. The Nuru vessels appeared as shifting clouds of gas and energy held together by force fields that rippled with colors that had no names in human language. And sometimes Hanna thought she could see faces in those clouds watching her through the transparent aluminum of the window. The Keth ships looked like they had been built by machines for machines, all sharp angles and geometric perfection that spoke of minds that thought in mathematics rather than emotions, and their black surfaces absorbed light like hungry mouths that never got full. 4 other alien designs floated among the larger ships, each one representing a species that humanity had heard of but never met face to face, and all of them had come here to judge whether humans deserved to continue spreading across the galaxy. Du Hyun sat at his communications station with headphones covering his ears, listening to the alien chatter that flowed between the ships in languages that sounded like music played on instruments made from elements that did not exist on Earth, and what he heard made his stomach turn cold with fear. The aliens called humans the infestation and the breeding plague, speaking of Earth's children as though they were some kind of disease that needed to be cured before it spread too far, and their words carried the weight of species that had been making decisions about life and death across the galaxy for thousands of years. They talked about population controls and territorial restrictions as though these were gifts they might grant to humanity if humans proved worthy. And the alternative they discussed in clinical tones involved words like sterilization and containment that made Do-hyun's hands shake as he typed his reports. The alien commanders spoke with the confidence of beings who had never lost a war and never doubted their right to decide which species deserved to exist, and their casual discussion of human extinction sounded like doctors talking about removing a tumor. But when Do-hyun delivered his intelligence report to Ambassador Tae-min, the older man just nodded slowly and set the crystal tablet down on his desk with the same care he might use when placing a flower in a vase. And his reaction surprised everyone who had expected panic or anger or desperate calls for military assistance. Instead of rushing to send messages to Earth or calling emergency sessions with the colonial governors, Tae-min walked to his private quarters and began packing his belongings with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. Hanna found him there an hour later, folding clothes into a travel case that looked like it had been waiting for this day for years. And when she asked what he was doing, he looked up at her with eyes that held sadness but no surprise. He told her that he had always known this day would come, that humans had spread too far and too fast for the older species to ignore forever, and that the Galactic Council had made its decision long before sending their fleet to deliver the ultimatum. The aliens expected humans to fight or beg or try to negotiate terms that might let them keep some of their colonies. But Tae-min understood something that the alien minds could not grasp about the species that had crawled out of Earth's gravity well and learned to dream among the stars. He began sending quiet messages to the 17 human colonies, not emergency broadcasts that would panic the population, but simple administrative notices that used codes established decades ago for situations that everyone hoped would never come. The messages went out on regular communication channels disguised as routine, reports about trade schedules and supply shipments, and only the colonial governors recognized the patterns that told them to begin implementing protocols that had been planned in secret for 50 years. On New Sol below, families began receiving messages telling them that certain job transfers had been approved and that transportation would be provided within the next few days, and children wondered why their parents suddenly started packing boxes and looking sad when they thought no one was watching. The human mining operations on the outer moons received orders to complete their current extraction projects ahead of schedule and prepare their equipment for long-term storage. And the workers grumbled about management decisions that made no sense until they started seeing the alien ships in their sky-tamen walked through the corridors of the orbital station and saw humans going about their daily routines with the same quiet determination that had carried their ancestors through wars and disasters and forced migrations across Earth's history. And he felt proud of his species even as his heart broke for what they were about to lose. The alien fleet waited in space like a judgment that had already been pronounced, and their communications continued to discuss human disposal with the casual efficiency of beings who had solved similar problems countless times across the galaxy, but something in the human response puzzled the alien commanders, who had expected desperate diplomatic initiatives or frantic military preparations, or at least some acknowledgement of the ultimatum they had delivered with such ceremony. Instead, they watched human ships beginning to move in patterns that looked almost like preparation for departure. But surely these primitive beings could not be considering abandoning worlds they had spent decades terraforming and building into thriving colonies. Du Hyun continued monitoring alien communications and reported that the fleet commanders were expressing confusion about human behavior, asking each other why these humans were not responding to their summons with the appropriate fear and desperation. The Vex Admiral Korthvar sent messages to his superiors asking for guidance about how to proceed when the subject species seemed to be ignoring the very serious nature of their situation, and his crystalline voice carried notes of bewilderment that had never appeared in his previous conquest. Reports Hanna watched from the observation deck as human cargo ships began arriving from the outer settlements, their holds full of personal belongings and precious items that families could not bear to leave behind, and the steady stream of vessels looked like a migration that had been planned for years rather than a panicked evacuation. The alien ships remained motionless in space, their weapons powered but not aimed, waiting for humanity to respond to their ultimatum with the desperation and bargaining that every other species had shown when faced with the Council's judgment. But the humans continued their quiet preparations with a dignity that confused and unsettled minds that had never encountered a species willing to choose exile over submission, and the silence from humanity grew louder with each passing hour. Taemin sealed his travel case and walked to the command center where Han-na and Do-hyun waited for orders that would never come, because the decision had already been made in the quiet councils of human leaders, who understood that some choices were more important than any victory. The crystal tablet lay forgotten on his desk, its alien symbols still glowing with demands that would receive no answer except the one humanity had chosen to give through their actions rather than their words outside the viewport. The alien fleet waited for a response that would come in ways they could never expect from minds that thought about survival differently than any species they had encountered in their long history of galactic conquest, the giants had called. And humanity had heard them, and now both species would learn what happened when an unstoppable force met an unmovable choice. Captain Jae-wook stood on the bridge of the transport vessel Mugunghwa and watched the orderly lines of families boarding his ship with the same calm determination their grandparents had shown when leaving Earth for uncertain futures among distant stars, carrying children and precious belongings with hands that did not shake, despite knowing they would never see these worlds again. The evacuation proceeded with mechanical precision that spoke of planning done in secret councils years before anyone had imagined the Galactic Council would arrive with their ultimatum, and each family received departure instructions that told them exactly what they could take and what they must leave behind for whoever claimed these worlds next. No one screamed or fought or demanded explanations from the colonial governors who supervised the loading procedures with gentle efficiency, and children asked quiet questions about why they were leaving, while their parents gave answers that spoke of new adventures rather than exile forced upon them by alien judgment. Jae-wook had supervised evacuations before during natural disasters and corporate relocations. But this felt different, because every person boarding his ship seemed to understand that they were participating in something larger than emergency response or business necessity. Ma Young walked through the research laboratories of New Seoul with a portable scanner, cataloging equipment and specimens that represented decades of careful study into terraforming techniques and alien ecology, and her reports would become part of detailed databases that someone else might use to continue the work. Humans had started, labeled everything in 7 different alien languages using translation programs that human linguists had developed during 50 years of careful observation and patient contact with species that had never bothered to learn human speech. And her notes explained how to maintain research projects that aliens might find useful. The xenobiology lab contained tissue samples from 43 different worlds and detailed genetic maps showing how Earth plants had been modified to thrive in alien soil, and Mi Young left operating instructions that would allow any species to continue experiments that might benefit the entire galaxy. Her final report described hybrid crops that could grow in radiation levels that would kill most organic life, and atmospheric processors that could turn dead worlds into gardens given enough time and patience. And she uploaded everything to databases that would remain accessible long after humans had disappeared beyond the galactic rim. The evacuation. Ships arrived on schedule at each of the 17 human colonies, and their holds filled with people who brought photo albums and musical instruments and small treasures that reminded them of home, but left behind functioning cities and thriving ecosystems for whatever species might claim them on New Busan. Sunja stood in the control room of the atmospheric processing facility and watched screens that showed oxygen levels rising in valleys that had been barren rock when humans first arrived 3 decades ago, and she felt pride mixed with sorrow as she prepared to hand over her life's work to strangers. The terraforming equipment would continue running automatically for another 50 years, slowly transforming the planet into something even more beautiful than the world humans were leaving behind. And Sunja had written maintenance manuals that explained every process in simple terms that any technologically advanced species could follow. She recorded video messages explaining the delicate balance required to keep the atmospheric generators running efficiently, and how the soil enhancement systems needed calibration every 6 months to prevent mineral buildup that could poison the carefully engineered ecosystem. Her final log entry went into the permanent database with instructions translated into every known alien language, offering detailed technical specifications and operational procedures to whoever might inherit responsibility for keeping New Busan's transformation on schedule. The terraforming computers would send status reports to monitoring stations throughout the galaxy, ensuring that any interested species could track the planet's progress and intervene if the automated systems encountered problems beyond their ability to solve. Sunja sealed the control room and activated security protocols that would protect the equipment while allowing authorized access to beings who might need to perform maintenance or modifications, and she left behind detailed personnel files showing which humans had expertise in different aspects of terraforming technology. The alien fleet followed the human exodus with instruments that detected no hidden weapons or booby traps among the abandoned facilities, and their scans revealed infrastructure left in perfect working condition with power systems that would operate reliably for decades. Admiral Korthvar sent increasingly puzzled reports to the Galactic Council, describing human behavior that made no sense according to standard conquest protocols, because defeated species typically either fought to the death or attempted to negotiate terms that might preserve some portion of their territory. Instead, humans seemed to be conducting an organized withdrawal that left behind valuable assets and functioning colonies that could be immediately occupied by other species, and their departure showed no signs of spite or sabotage that military planners had learned to expect from conquered populations. The Vex crystalline ships detected no explosive devices hidden in human facilities, and thermal scans revealed no evidence of systematic destruction or poisoning of water supplies or contamination of agricultural systems. Human ships broadcast their departure schedules on open channels that any alien vessel could monitor, and their navigation plans showed routes that led away from Council space rather than toward hidden military bases or secret rendezvous points with reinforcement fleets. Captain Jawook received passenger manifests from the other evacuation ships and confirmed that the human exodus included every family and individual from all 17 colonies, with no one left behind to conduct guerrilla warfare or sabotage operations. The transport captains maintained regular communication with each other using standard frequencies that alien listeners could easily intercept, and their conversations focused on navigation concerns and passenger comfort rather than military objectives or revenge planning. Ma Young compiled final reports showing that humans had cataloged and preserved samples of native life forms from every world they had settled, storing genetic material in cryogenic facilities that would remain stable for centuries. Her databases included detailed ecological studies showing how human terraforming had actually enhanced biodiversity on most worlds by creating new habitats that supported both Earth species and native organisms that had adapted to the modified environments. The research stations contained libraries of agricultural techniques and biotechnology innovations that could help any species feed growing populations or adapt to challenging environmental conditions. And all of this knowledge was freely available to whoever claimed the abandoned colonies. Human medical facilities remained fully stocked with equipment and supplies that could treat a wide variety of species, and their databases included treatment protocols for diseases that affected multiple galactic civilizations. The evacuation proceeded according to schedules that had clearly been prepared long before the Council fleet arrived, and every aspect of the human departure demonstrated planning and preparation that spoke of species-wide acceptance of an outcome they had anticipated for years. Jawook watched the last families board his ship and saw faces that showed sadness but not surprise, as though leaving these worlds had always been understood as a possibility that might someday become necessary. The colonial governors transmitted final status reports to databases that would remain accessible to alien researchers, and their messages included detailed histories of human settlement and development projects that had transformed dead worlds into thriving ecosystems. Administrative records showed careful resource management and environmental protection policies that had preserved natural features while developing human settlements, and geological surveys marked mineral deposits and underground water sources that future inhabitants might find valuable. The human ships formed convoy formations that protected civilian vessels while broadcasting peaceful intentions on all communication frequencies, and their departure routes took them through empty space that avoided any possibility of conflict with alien patrol routes. Soonja transmitted her final terraforming report from New Busan and included recommendations for species that might want to continue the atmospheric modification process, along with warnings about potential problems that could arise if the automated systems were not properly maintained. Her message ended with coordinates for supply caches containing replacement parts and backup equipment that would allow any competent engineering team to keep the terraforming systems running for another century. The alien fleet maintained surveillance of the human exodus, but detected no hidden agendas or secret plans among the departing ships, and their intelligence analysts found no evidence of deception or misdirection in human communications. Captain Jawook sealed the cargo holds of the Mugung Hua and began final departure preparations while his passengers settled into quarters that would be their homes for months or years as humanity searched for new worlds beyond the reach of the Galactic Council. Vorthagon floated in the council chamber on Centralis Prime and addressed the assembled delegates with words that should have carried triumph, but instead fell flat in the vast space where 7 species had gathered to celebrate their victory over the human expansion problem. The great chamber stretched upward into shadows that seemed to swallow light and sound, its crystalline walls designed to amplify voices and project authority. But today the architecture felt hollow, and the celebration rang with emptiness that none of the delegates wanted to acknowledge. Around the circular platform, representatives from each member species displayed their formal regalia and ceremonial weapons that symbolized their power to enforce galactic law. But the humans had surrendered without testing any of those weapons or challenging any of that authority. Vorthgen's gaseous form shifted through colors that indicated satisfaction mixed with confusion as he recited statistics about the 17 worlds that had been peacefully transferred to Council control without a single shot fired or a single demand for negotiation. The Nuru delegate's voice resonated through translation devices that converted his electromagnetic speech patterns into sounds the other species could understand. But his words carried undertones that suggested questions rather than certainty about the meaning of their bloodless victory. Keth Unit Prime activated its vocal processors and interrupted the celebration with mechanical precision that cut through. Diplomatic politeness like a laser through armor plating, asking why biological entities would abandon valuable territory without attempting to preserve some portion for their continued survival. The artificial intelligence that spoke for the Keth Collective had analyzed human behavior patterns and found them inconsistent with standard biological imperatives for territorial preservation and resource acquisition, and its questions made the other delegates uncomfortable. Keth Unit Prime's optical sensors projected data onto the chamber's central display, showing detailed scans of the abandoned human colonies, and every facility remained in perfect working condition with no evidence of sabotage or spite. The mechanical delegate's analysis revealed infrastructure investments representing thousands of years of labor and resources that humans had simply walked away from as though worlds were temporary. Possessions rather than permanent foundations for species, survival atmospheric processors continued their work transforming dead planets into garden worlds that would be ready for full colonization within decades. And fusion reactors provided clean energy that could power alien cities for centuries without maintenance. Agricultural systems produced food surpluses that could feed millions of beings, and medical facilities contained equipment and databases that could advance galactic healthcare by generations, all left behind by humans who seemed to consider such gifts normal rather than extraordinary. Zilthara emerged from her aquatic life support tank to address the council through speakers that transmitted her sonar-based communication into audible frequencies, and her words carried currents of unease that spread through the chamber like ripples in disturbed water. The Mool delegate had studied recordings of human behavior during the evacuation and found patterns that confused minds accustomed to conquest. Scenarios where defeated species either fought to destruction or begged for mercy that might preserve some remnant of their civilization. Instead, humans had conducted themselves with dignity that suggested they viewed exile as an acceptable alternative to conflict, and their peaceful departure implied understanding of galactic politics that other species had never demonstrated. Zilthara's analysis of human departure protocols revealed planning that must have begun decades before any formal contact with the Galactic Council. As though these beings had anticipated this outcome and prepared accordingly, the evacuation had proceeded with efficiency that suggested species-wide coordination and acceptance of leadership decisions, but without the desperate haste that typically characterized retreats by defeated populations. Orn stepped forward from the Vex delegation and projected holographic displays showing detailed surveys of human colony sites, his crystalline form resonating with harmonics that indicated scientific curiosity mixed with growing concern about the implications of their findings. The young Vex analyst had spent months studying human settlement patterns and discovered that their expansion had followed carefully planned routes that avoided direct competition with established alien territories. Human colonies had been established on worlds that Council surveys had classified as marginal or worthless, and their terraforming technology had transformed these rejected planets into valuable real estate that could support millions of inhabitants. The pattern suggested that humans had been deliberately avoiding confrontation with alien civilizations, while developing techniques for creating habitable worlds from resources that other species considered unusable. Orn's data showed that human expansion had actually increased the galaxy's total habitable surface area rather than competing for existing territory, and their methods could be applied to thousands of worlds that currently lay barren and ignored. His analysis revealed that humans had been solving resource scarcity problems that the Galactic Council had not even recognized as solvable, and their departure meant the loss of knowledge that could have benefited every species in the galaxy. The holographic displays showed before and after images of human terraforming projects, and the transformation of dead worlds into thriving ecosystems represented achievements that alien science had considered impossible or economically unfeasible. Kyungsu's archived logs appeared on screens throughout the chamber as Orn translated the human archivist's records into languages the council delegates could understand, and his words revealed planning that went back generations. The human documentation showed contingency protocols for scenarios that included forced exodus from galactic civilization, and their preparations had encompassed not just evacuation procedures, but also gift-giving traditions that honored future inhabitants of abandoned worlds. Kyung-soo had written about the Korean concept of leaving places better than you found them, and how human settlement philosophy emphasized stewardship rather than ownership of planetary resources. His records included debates among human leaders about whether to resist council authority or choose exile, and the decision to leave peacefully had been made by democratic consensus rather than imposed by military defeat. The Human Archives revealed that they had studied galactic politics for decades and understood that their rapid expansion would eventually trigger a response from established powers. But they had chosen to prepare for departure rather than prepare for war council. Delegates began asking uncomfortable questions about the nature of their victory and whether the human threat had ever actually existed, or if their own fears had created an enemy where none had been intended. Vorthgen attempted to maintain celebration protocols, but his electromagnetic field fluctuated with uncertainty, as other delegates raised concerns about the precedent they had set by forcing peaceful beings into exile without attempting diplomatic solutions. Keth Unit Prime calculated resource losses from human departure and projected economic impacts that would affect every member species for decades, and its mathematical models showed declining galactic prosperity without human innovation and productivity. The mechanical intelligence noted that humans had been contributing to galactic civilization through trade and research rather than consuming resources at the expense of other species, and their absence would create shortages in multiple sectors. Zilthara reviewed recordings of human diplomatic contacts and found no evidence of aggressive intentions or territorial ambitions that would justify forced exile, and her analysis suggested that council fears had been based on misunderstanding rather than actual threats. The Mole delegates' sonar-based memory systems recalled every interaction between humans and other species, and the patterns showed consistent peaceful behavior and willingness to compromise on territorial disputes. The celebration that should have marked successful resolution of the human expansion problem instead became a questioning session where delegates examined evidence that suggested they had made a terrible mistake. Council records showed that humans had never violated galactic law or threatened other species, and their rapid expansion had been driven by population pressure and wanderlust rather than conquest ambitions. The 17 worlds they had abandoned represented decades of patient work, transforming hostile environments into places where life could flourish, and their gift of this infrastructure to the galaxy demonstrated generosity that no other species had ever shown. Orn's final analysis revealed that humanity's departure had cost the galaxy more than any war could have, because they had taken with them knowledge and perspectives that could have solved problems no other species had even attempted to address. The empty human colonies stood as monuments to opportunities lost and wisdom squandered, and the Council's hollow victory tasted like ashes in the mouths of beings who began to understand what they had driven away through fear and misunderstanding. Helcor walked through the empty corridors of what had once been New Andong and listened to the humming of fusion reactors that continued their patient work 3 years after the last human had departed, their automated systems maintaining power levels that could support a city of millions, even though only exploration teams now visited these abandoned halls. The young Keth explorer's mechanical limbs moved with precise efficiency as he documented the condition of human infrastructure, and his sensors detected no degradation in equipment that had been designed to operate for decades without maintenance. Hydroponic gardens flourished under artificial sunlight that cycled through precise patterns mimicking the seasonal changes of distant Earth, and their automated systems produced fresh vegetables and fruits that fed the small alien research teams who had come to study human agricultural techniques. The orbital defense platforms remained functional but dormant, their weapons systems powered down but ready to activate if properly commanded. And Halecor's analysis revealed that humans had left behind military technology that could have been used against the Council fleet but had chosen not to activate it. His reports to the Keth Collective described human colony infrastructure as a gift that kept giving long after the givers had disappeared, and the precision engineering that had built these cities represented advances that alien science was only beginning to understand. The fusion reactors used containment methods that were more efficient than anything in the Keth databases, and the power distribution systems operated with redundancies that made catastrophic failures nearly impossible. Hailcore transmitted technical specifications to Keth engineers, who studied human designs with the admiration that artificial intelligences reserved for particularly elegant solutions to complex problems. Jexeril floated through the trading stations of Council Space and compiled economic reports that painted a picture of galactic commerce gradually declining without the human contribution. That had seemed so small when measured against the entire galaxy, but proved significant when it disappeared. The Mool Trade Coordinator's sonar-based calculations revealed that human colonies had been producing 23% of the galaxy's rare earth elements using mining techniques that extracted valuable minerals without destroying planetary ecosystems. Human biotechnology had supplied 31% of medical compounds that were essential for treating diseases affecting multiple species, and their pharmaceutical research had been advancing at rates that alien scientists found difficult to match. The terraforming operations that humans had developed were the most efficient in known space, transforming dead worlds into habitable environments in time frames that other species considered impossible. Jexeral's reports showed that human agricultural innovations had been feeding not just their own colonies, but also supplying emergency food aid to alien settlements that faced crop failures or environmental disasters. The economic impact of human departure created shortages that alien technology struggled to replace, and prices for rare elements and medical supplies increased dramatically as other species attempted to fill production gaps. Trade routes that had connected human colonies with alien markets now carried empty cargo ships that returned to port without the exotic goods and innovative technologies that human settlements had provided. Jexeral calculated that replacing human productivity would require massive infrastructure investments by multiple species working together. But coordination among council members proceeded slowly because none wanted to admit how much they had lost. Velara composed philosophical treatises in the crystal caves of her homeworld and questioned the nature of victory that felt more like defeat with each passing day, her thoughts resonating through crystalline formations that amplified and refined ideas until they achieved perfect clarity. The Vex philosopher's meditations focused on the gap between council assumptions about human nature and the evidence of human behavior, and her writings explored the possibility that wisdom sometimes appeared in forms that power could not recognize. Her analysis of human departure suggested that true strength might be demonstrated through choosing exile over conflict rather than through military resistance or diplomatic maneuvering. Velara's essays circulated through Vex intellectual networks and challenged traditional concepts of conquest and surrender, asking whether species that left gifts for their enemies possessed qualities that warriors could not comprehend. The philosophical implications of human behavior troubled minds that had been raised to believe in clear distinctions between victory and defeat, and Velara's questions about the nature of true civilization spread beyond Vex society to influence thinkers among other species. Her writings suggested that humans had demonstrated a form of moral authority that military force could not touch, and their peaceful departure had established a standard of behavior that made council actions appear petty and vindictive. Velara's most controversial work proposed that the galaxy had been judged by human actions rather than humans being judged by council decisions, and that exile had been chosen by the morally superior party in a conflict they refused to fight. Dujin's final transmission appeared in Deep Space Monitoring Station archives 3 years after it had been sent, his voice carrying across the void, to remind alien listeners of words they had tried to forget. The human communications officer's message had been broadcast on emergency frequencies that every civilized species monitored, ensuring that his words would be preserved in official records that could not be deleted or suppressed. His simple statement about leaving in peace and coming in peace resonated through alien consciousness like a judgment that grew more powerful with repetition, and translation programs carried his meaning into every language spoken in council space. Dojin had spoken about stars being vast enough for all species, but questioned whether all species were vast enough for the stars, and his words implied that humanity's departure reflected limitations in their judges rather than flaws in themselves. The transmission included navigational data showing human ships heading toward empty regions beyond the galactic rim, and their trajectory suggested no intention of returning or establishing bases for future attacks. Dujin's voice carried the sadness of permanent farewell mixed with dignity that refused to acknowledge defeat, and his message became a haunting Reminder of opportunities lost through fear and misunderstanding, young members of Council species began analyzing the human transmission and comparing its tone with historical records of other conquered populations. And they found no precedent for beings who spoke of exile as though it were a gift they were giving to their conquerors. Velara's students studied Dojin's words as examples of moral authority that transcended military power, and their discussions spread through academic networks where young minds questioned the wisdom of their elders' decisions. The growing influence of human philosophy among alien youth created tensions within Council societies as questions arose about whether forced exile represented justice or merely the exercise of superior force against peaceful neighbors. Dojin's transmission became a symbol of human dignity that alien historians would study for generations, and his words challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between power and righteousness. Underground networks of young aliens began sharing human literature and philosophy that had been preserved in colonial databases, and their secret discussions focused on concepts of peaceful resistance and moral authority that human thinkers had developed. The silence where humanity once existed became filled with questions that Council leaders could not answer without admitting mistakes. They were not prepared to acknowledge economic reports continued documenting the decline in galactic prosperity without human innovation and productivity. But political leaders dismissed these concerns as temporary adjustments that alien science would eventually overcome. However, the growing influence of human ideas among young aliens suggested that humanity's greatest impact on galactic civilization might come after their departure rather than during their presence. The empty human colonies stood as monuments to possibilities that had been rejected through fear, and their automated systems continued working toward goals that absent humans would never see. Accomplished. Helcor's technical reports described human infrastructure as engineering poetry that combined function with beauty in ways that purely logical minds found surprisingly moving. Jexerol's economic analyses showed cascading effects from human absence that would reshape galactic commerce for decades, forcing species to cooperate in ways they had avoided while humans provided services that made such cooperation unnecessary. The growing silence where human voices once contributed to galactic civilization became a presence that haunted Council chambers and reminded delegates of choices that could never be undone. Morith stood in the observation deck of the Council flagship 10 years after humanity's departure and stared into the deep void beyond the galactic rim where long-range sensors detected no trace of human civilization, no distress signals calling for rescue, no expanding empire preparing for revenge against the species that had driven them into exile. The eldest Vex counselor's crystalline form had grown dim with age and the weight of decisions that seemed wise at the time but had revealed their true cost only through the passage of years that brought understanding too late for redemption. The sensors that could detect energy signatures across thousands of light years found nothing but empty space where human ships had disappeared, carrying with them knowledge and perspectives that the galaxy had not known it needed until they were gone. Morith's memories stretched back through centuries of Council decisions about territorial disputes and species management, but none of those precedents had prepared him for the hollow victory that tasted more bitter with each passing year behind him. The Council chamber sat nearly empty because delegates from member species no longer attended meetings with the enthusiasm they had once shown for galactic governance, and their absence reflected growing doubts about the wisdom of forcing choices. Between submission and exile, Yulsep approached the observation deck with data tablets containing his decade-long study of human behavior and its implications for galactic civilization, and his findings would force the Council to confront truths they had spent years trying to ignore. The Nuru researcher's electromagnetic field fluctuated with patterns that indicated profound disturbance as he began presenting conclusions that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and Council authority. His research had analyzed every recorded interaction between humans and other species across 50 years of contact, and the patterns revealed consistent behavior that contradicted official narratives about aggressive expansion and territorial ambition. Yulsep's data showed that humans had followed careful colonization protocols designed to avoid conflict with established alien territories, settling only on worlds that Council surveys had classified as worthless or unsuitable for known forms of life. The human settlements had actually increased galactic habitability through terraforming technologies that transformed dead planets into thriving ecosystems. expanding the total amount of living space available to all species rather than competing for existing resources. His analysis revealed that human population growth had been managed through voluntary emigration to new worlds rather than through conquest of territory belonging to other species, and their expansion represented exploration rather than empire building. The most damning evidence in Eulsep's report came from economic models showing that human productivity had been supporting alien civilizations through trade relationships that provided essential resources at prices below production costs. Human agricultural innovations had been feeding not just their own colonies, but also supplying emergency aid to alien settlements during crop failures and environmental disasters. And their medical research had advanced treatment options for diseases affecting multiple species. Eulsep's calculations proved that humanity had been contributing more to galactic civilization than they had been consuming, and their departure had created shortages and economic instability that continued to worsen a decade later. The Nuru researchers' final conclusion shattered the last justifications for Council actions by demonstrating that humans had never posed any threat to alien civilizations except the threat of making other species appear less generous and innovative by comparison. Kiltar emerged from the aquatic sections of the Council station with archives that contained the most painful revelation of all, documents that revealed the true pattern of human colonization and the careful planning that had guided their expansion across 17 star systems. The young mole diplomat had spent years analyzing navigation records and settlement reports that painted a picture completely different from Council assumptions about aggressive human expansion, threatening established alien territories. Human colonies had been established following routes that deliberately avoided Council space, and their navigation charts showed careful planning to minimize contact with alien civilizations that might view human expansion as threatening. The 17 settlements represented not an empire, but a careful migration path around the edges of known galactic civilization, with each world chosen for its distance from alien territories rather than its strategic value or resource potential. Kiltar's discovery of human settlement patterns revealed that they had been following a migration route that would have taken them beyond the galactic rim within another generation, making their forced exile merely an acceleration of plans they had already been implementing. The Mole diplomat's sonar-based analysis of human communication patterns during the evacuation showed coordination that could only have resulted from decades of preparation for the possibility that they might need to leave galactic civilization entirely. Human leaders had anticipated that their rapid population growth and successful terraforming would eventually trigger a response from established powers, and they had chosen to prepare for peaceful departure rather than military resistance. Kiltar's research revealed that the evacuation protocols used during their exile had been refined through regular drills and planning sessions that treated departure from the galaxy as a potential necessity rather than a catastrophic failure. The evidence suggested that humans had always viewed their presence in Council space as temporary, and their willingness to leave peacefully reflected long-term thinking about species survival that other civilizations had never demonstrated. Sang Ho's personal logs appeared on screens throughout the Council station as Kiltar presented the final piece of evidence that would haunt galactic civilization for generations to come. The human engineer's archived writings revealed that humanity had spent 50 years studying galactic politics and reaching conclusions about the incompatibility between human expansion and Council authority. Sang Ho had written about the choice between integration with galactic civilization and independence beyond its borders, and human leadership had chosen independence rather than submission to authority they did not respect. His logs described human debates about whether to resist Council demands or accept exile, and the democratic consensus had favored dignity over defiance as the response that best represented human values. Sang Ho's writings revealed that humans had understood something about galactic politics that other species had missed, recognizing that some forms of victory were more costly than any defeat. The human engineer had written about Council fears and prejudices that would make peaceful coexistence impossible, and his analysis had predicted the ultimatum years before the Council fleet arrived with their demands. His final entries described human preparations for exile not as surrender, but as liberation from the need to accommodate minds that could not understand the difference between expansion and aggression sang Ho's. Logs ended with observations about the galaxy growing larger through absence and smaller through knowledge, and his words became prophecy as council species discovered the truth about what they had lost. Morith absorbed the weight of evidence that proved beyond doubt that the council had driven away the most innovative and generous species they had ever encountered, forcing exile upon beings whose only crime had been succeeding too well at solving problems other civilizations could not address. The Vex Elder's crystalline structure resonated with harmonics of regret as he realized that humanity's departure had demonstrated moral superiority that no military force could challenge or defeat council records showed that humans had never violated galactic law or threatened other species, and their rapid expansion had been driven by population pressure and scientific curiosity rather than conquest ambitions. The 17 worlds they had abandoned continued operating under automated systems that produced resources and maintained ecosystems that benefited every species in the galaxy, and their gift of this infrastructure demonstrated generosity that shamed those who had forced their departure. Yulsep's economic projections showed that replacing human innovation and productivity would require centuries of coordinated effort by multiple species working together with cooperation that council politics made nearly impossible. The silence where humanity once contributed to galactic civilization had become a judgment that grew more powerful with each passing year, reminding every species of opportunities lost through fear and prejudice. Kiltar's analysis of human migration patterns revealed that they had been following a carefully planned route that would have taken them beyond galactic borders within another generation, making their exile merely an acceleration of destiny they had chosen for themselves. The young aliens who studied human philosophy and literature found in those works perspectives on civilization and progress that challenged fundamental assumptions. About power and authority, Morith understood finally that the Council had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history: the voluntary departure of a species that chose dignity over dominance and wisdom over war. The empty space beyond the galactic rim where human ships had disappeared became a reminder that some victories cost more than any defeat.